History 300, The Origins of the First World War. Lecture 11, The Balkan Wars, 1912 to 1913. In the last lecture, we looked at the three main crises that brought the great powers close to war from 1905 to 1911. Today we're going to examine the two Balkan Wars of 1912 and 1913 that immediately preceded the outbreak of the First World War. The outcome of the Balkan Wars was to play an important role in the July crisis of 1914, and so the two conflicts are worth studying in their own right. But they're also interesting because, once again, they were a crisis which did not lead to general war. In fact, the peaceful resolution of the Balkan Wars may have created a false sense of security amongst some European statesmen that led to disastrous complacency on their part after the death of Franz Ferdinand the following year. The immediate cause of the Balkan Wars was the decision by Italy to attack Ottoman Turkey in September 1911. The Italians had long coveted Ottoman territory in North Africa and the Eastern Mediterranean, and they'd been encouraged by other aggressive moves by the great powers, namely Austria's annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908 and France's decision to send troops to occupy Morocco in 1911. The Italo-Turkish War was an expensive and somewhat pointless exercise so far as the Italians were concerned. Certainly it was successful, but most of the territory the Italians captured in Libya was desert wasteland, quite devoid of any economic value and useless for colonization. The conflict is remembered mainly today because it involved the pioneering use of air power. On November 1st, 1911, the first ever aerial bombing mission took place, when an Italian pilot flying a primitive monoplane dropped a bag of hand grenades on a Turkish supply depot. At the time, however, what caught most people's attention about the war was the lamentable condition of the Turkish military. Italy was by no means one of the stronger of the great powers, yet the Ottomans were chased from the field without great difficulty. If the Italians could conquer Ottoman territory in North Africa so easily, what was to stop the Balkan powers from conquering what remained of the Ottoman Empire in southeastern Europe? That was the conclusion drawn by Nicholas Hartwig, the Russian ambassador in Belgrade, and the man who, without explicit permission from St. Petersburg, connived to draw the Balkan states into an anti-Turkish alliance, which became known as the Balkan League. Hartwig was not particularly ill-disposed towards the Ottomans, but he hated Austria-Hungary, and he feared that if the Serbs, Greeks, Montenegrins and Bulgarians didn't act first, the Austrians might attack Turkey themselves, and so seize the Ottoman territory of their own volition. That he was determined to prevent. What became known as the First Balkan War officially broke out on October the 8th, 1912, while the Italo-Turkish War was still going on, when Montenegro declared war on Constantinople. A few days later, the other members of the Balkan League, Bulgaria, Serbia and Greece, did the same. As in Libya, the course of military events went very badly for the Ottomans. The Turkish forces were swept into rapid retreat, and by November they had been driven all the way back to the gates of Constantinople itself. It was at that point, as the fighting in the Balkans started to peter out, that Sir Edward Grey, the British Foreign Secretary, interceded. He proposed that a conference of great powers should be held in London to decide on what the post-war map of the Balkans should look like. This was a classic diplomatic step, and one that had been used several times during the 19th century to find a compromise solution to European quarrels, and so prevent general war. All-power conferences had recently met to decide the fate of Morocco. Grey's delegates arrived in London in December and met throughout the spring. One of the central issues was the fate of the port of Durazzo, or Durrës as it's now known, on the Adriatic coast. The Kingdom of Serbia was landlocked in 1912, and one of the key Serbian war aims had been to seize Durazzo and so provide itself with an economic channel to the Mediterranean. But this was fiercely resisted by the Austrians. Their delegates argued that the majority population in and around Durazzo were not Serbs or even South Slavs at all, but a distinct ethnic group which spoke their own language, were predominantly Muslim rather than Orthodox Christian, and who, if they were no longer to be subjects of the Ottomans, ought to be allowed to create an independent state of their own. The Italians, who also had designs on the region, also wanted Durazzo to remain independent of Serbia. Russia supported Serbia, but the French made it clear that they did not regard the issue as one that involved their own vital national interest, and that they would not back the Russians up if it came to a showdown with Austria. Reluctantly then, the Serbs had no choice but to withdraw the troops who had occupied Durazzo. The Kingdom of Albania was created, which, though it has long lost its king and is now a republic, still exists to this day. The final Treaty of London confirming all this was signed on May the 30th, 1913, but events were going to take a surprise turn. The Bulgarians, though they had won some generous spoils as a result of the war, remained unhappy. They felt that they should have been granted even more territory which had been awarded to Greece and Serbia instead. So on June 29, 1913, the Bulgarians launched a surprise attack on their Balkan League allies. It was a foolish move, as it turned out. Not only did the Serbs and Greeks mount a successful defence, but Romania, which up to this point had remained neutral, now decided to launch an attack of its own on Bulgaria. Even the Ottomans, seeing an opportunity to recoup some of their losses from the previous year, attacked Bulgarian forces outside Constantinople. This so-called Second Balkan War ended with the Treaty of Bucharest in August 1913, which amended some of the awards given out in the Treaty of London back in May. Bulgaria was the big loser in this second round of fighting. Not only did it have to surrender territory to the Serbs and Greeks, but Romania received a slice of northern Bulgaria for its pains, and the Turks were able to reacquire some of the lost province of Eastern Thrace, which they had been driven out of the year before. Although the violence of the two Balkan Wars would soon be overshadowed by the even more horrific conflict of 1914, they were bloody affairs nonetheless, resulting in perhaps 500,000 direct military deaths and many more civilians killed in the violent pogroms and campaigns of ethnic cleansing which followed the exchanges of territory. For the various large and small powers involved, the results of the Balkan Wars were mixed. The Austrians were pleased about the creation of Albania, but some Austrian government and military leaders had wanted to go further and to declare war on Serbia while it was distracted by the fighting to the south. The main reason this had not happened was that the Germans had shown no interest in backing them up. Austro-German relations were therefore strained, and the Germans realised that if they failed to come to Austria's aid again against Russia, they might be jeopardising the future of the dual alliance. Similarly, the French had been disinclined to get involved in the crisis, and they knew that they could not afford to play such a limited role the next time a crisis in the Balkans developed, for fear that they might sunder their alliance with the Russians permanently. The Serbs gained a large amount of territory from the two Balkan Wars, but they were infuriated by their inability to hold on to Durazzo, one of their principal aims, and felt that Russia had let them down. Twice now since the Austro-Hungarian annexation of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1908, the Serbs had been foiled by the Habsburgs, and twice the government in St. Petersburg had not backed them up to the extent that they felt was appropriate. Things would have to be different next time if the Russians wanted to maintain their status as the patrons of the South Slavs. The Russians were probably the biggest losers of all. Hartwig's great achievement had been to bring traditional rivals Bulgaria and Serbia into a common alliance. But Bulgaria's decision to backstab its neighbour in 1913 had broken up Hartwig's short-lived Balkan League for good. And Russia had been forced to choose sides during the Second Balkan War. Its decision to back Serbia had alienated the Bulgarians, who now made overtures to the Triple Alliance. And sure enough, during the First World War, Bulgaria would side with Germany and Austria-Hungary. Russia had lost an important Balkan ally in Bulgaria. It could not afford to lose another. If Serbia were threatened again, St. Petersburg would have no choice but to back it to the hilt, or else lose all influence in the Balkans completely. But in London, Sir Edward Grey did not see things this way. To him, the lessons of the Balkan Wars was that the balance of power could still be effectively maintained by international agreement between the European great powers. Pleased by his own accomplishments at the London Conference, he greatly overestimated his own crisis management ability. During the July crisis in 1914, this may have discouraged him from taking a swift and firm line in support of his Entente partners France and Russia, which sent precisely the wrong signals to Germany at the moment its government was deciding what to do. The Balkan Wars increased the antagonism between Austria and Serbia, and some Serbs were driven to take violent action against Austria to punish it for its villainy. The target of their retribution would turn out to be the empire's heir presumptive, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. In the next lecture, we'll introduce ourselves to this crucial and tragic figure in the history of 20th century Europe. See you then.